Good evening. Hello, my name is Kirsty Bennett. Welcome to FAIL. I'm delighted to be back hosting this event. FAIL is a social entrepreneurship project, and the whole idea behind it came from some very creative grad students, is to try and change the conversation and the culture around failure in academia. To get us all talking a bit more about our failures, maybe laughing about them just a tiny bit, learning from them, and moving on. That's the idea of the event tonight. And so what we do is we invite people that you really don't necessarily associate with failure. If you've read your program, you'll know what I'm talking about. And we get them to come up here and talk about the times they faced a bump in the road. And that's what we're going to do tonight. By a round of applause, who was at the last FAIL event we had in the spring? Hi, cool, welcome back. I have some bad news for you. I'm going to be telling all of the same jokes. By a round of applause, who is this your first FAIL event? Yeah. I have some great news for you. I'm going to be debuting all new material tonight. I cannot wait for you to hear it. Before I get things going, I have a list of people just to acknowledge, because it takes a lot of people to make tonight happen. So I want to give a shout out to Mind, Hand, Heart, MIT Visiting Student Association, the Teaching and Learning Lab, the Flipping Failure Project, the Graduate Student Council, the Sandbox Initiative, John Werner, Executive in Residence at Kohler Labs, and MITEL. Thank you for all you did to get tonight going. Yeah, let's do that. I have some housekeeping for you. First up, please don't bring any food in. If you brought food in, hide it. Hide it well. On a food note, after the event, we're going to be heading down to Lobby 10, and we're going to have food and drinks and mingling, so please stick around and come to that afterwards. We have a QR code up on the screen, and with the QR code, you can submit your own fails. So if you have a little failure you might want to share with us from your own life, you can submit it via the code, and I will read them, and then in between the speakers tonight, I will read some out, and so you don't have to put your name on it. It's just a fun way to participate from your seat. And also at the end of tonight, we're going to have a Q&A. So if you have a question for any one of the speakers in particular, or all of the speakers in general, you can submit that through the QR code as well. And finally, when you came in tonight, you were given a colorful index card as part of the Flipping Failure Project. That's a place where you can write down a story of struggle related to your time in academia here. We'll collect them in as you leave, and we're going to put them up on a poster board downstairs in Lobby 10 for the event. So we can all together bask in our collective lack of glory, and it will be healing and funny and warm and wonderful. And I also have to give a shout out because we're being live streamed tonight. There's some people who can't join us, most of which are overseas. So I want to say a big hello to everybody watching around the world. Hello. So last time I hosted this, I thought about my own failures, and I did that again for tonight. And specifically, I thought about the failures that I caused myself by my own personality, I suppose. So one of the things about me is I'm not very good at conflict. Not in the way you think, like I'm good in a crisis. I'm just not very good at inconveniencing strangers, I guess. So if I'm at the grocery store, and there is like, I want to get the pasta sauce, and someone's standing in front of the pasta sauce, I have to stand next to them and pretend I really care about the jarred olives until they move, and then I can get the pasta sauce. That's stupid. I could just reach across and take it, but there's something about it that just, I can't do it. So this came up this summer. I flew from Boston to San Francisco, and I was really excited about this flight, believe it or not. It was the first time in 2 years I was going to fly alone with no child on my lap. It's going to be amazing. I didn't really have much work to do, a couple emails. So I'm going to watch movies. I'm going to order a glass of wine, even though it's a 10 a.m. flight. I'm really going to like luxuriate in my freedom. And when we fly, there are rules. The rules are not written down, but we all know the rules. The rules are things like, if you're in the middle seat, you get possession of both armrests. That's a rule. If it's a daytime flight, don't recline your seat the whole way back. That's a rule. And if you're in the aisle seat, you have to be nice about people going up to the bathroom. Like, that's a rule. I don't make the rules. Those are just the rules. Now, I get on my flight, and I have the window seat. And I hear the announcement that the boarding door is closed. And I look up and I realize I have won economy class jackpot. I'm in a row of 3, there's someone in the aisle, and the middle seat is empty. This is such a bargain. This is like getting business class space for economy class money. I love it. And there are rules. There are rules about the middle seat. So you can put the armrest up and you can like spread out a bit, but you can't go past the midway point. It's a rule. You can put the tray table down and you can put like overflow on it, but you have to make sure that there's room for the other person's overflow as well. Basically what I'm saying is it's kind of like a no man's land of a seat. It's a shared space. Now, I hadn't actually moved into the no man's land yet. I was sending my few emails, I was checking what movie I was gonna watch, and the person in the seat on the end, she suddenly turned her laptop towards me. She was watching a TV show, and she got up, and she sat in the middle seat, and she put her feet up on the aisle seat, and then she leaned against me and watched her show, and I was trapped between the wall of the plane and a human, and also by my own inability to confront a stranger. And so I fumed quietly, and I didn't really know what to do, so I sort of shuffled a bit, and I sighed to make it show that I don't like being leaned on, but she didn't seem to notice at all. So I had my laptop out, so I wrote an email to my friend describing what was happening as the most passive-aggressive thing that you can possibly do. And after about 20 minutes of like lamenting my lost perfect flight with my glass of wine and my space and my movies, she got up and she went to the bathroom. And I was like, here's my chance. So I lifted up the armrest and I gently, like slightly spread a leg across onto the middle seat, not too far, not past the midway point. I put the laptop away, headphones in, movie on, is dead straight ahead. And then she came back and I saw her like in my periphery. And then she got back and she didn't acknowledge that anything has changed, and she sort of shuffled across, and then she got to the middle seat and she sat down on my leg. And it was this very slow split second where she spun around and looked at me, and I looked at her, and I was like, this is it. This is the moment. This is the fight or flight. So I got all my courage and I squeaked, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to keep that seat clear. It was like my voice, but more pathetic. Like a fire marshal, like I have to keep it clear. And she just said, okay. And she went back to her seat, and it felt like the most incredible triumph. Like I had vanquished my own continual failure. It did mean that I had to spend 6 hours in that seat and couldn't once ask to get up because I was too afraid. But you know, it's incremental achievements is what I'm talking about. So there you go. That's a little bit of failure from me. All right, so I'm going to introduce your speakers tonight. And you know what they're all about because you have your bios. It tells you what they're up to and all the things that they do. So what I did was ask them what their power song is. Now, a power song is the song that you listen to when you need to get revved up. The rules are simple. You can't be embarrassed about it. Whatever it is, whatever works for you, that's fine. You don't choose your power song. It chooses you. For a couple years, mine was Miley Cyrus' Party in the USA. It's currently My Shot from Hamilton, which is slightly cooler, but that doesn't matter, as I said. So, our first speaker tonight is Sandy Pentland, and I asked him what his power song would be. And first of all, he gave me the refrain. You have to know when to hold 'em, you have to know when to fold 'em, know when to walk away, and know when to run. That's The Gambler by Kenny Rogers. Please welcome Sandy Pentland.
Okay. So this was really hard to come up with because I don't think of failure. And the reason I don't think of failure is that I'm sort of a gambler. I grew up in a very rough neighborhood. Bad things happened, and you were very aware that you were taking a chance anytime you did anything. So instead of thinking about failure, I think about, you're placing bets. You're always like looking for the edge, trying not to get shot, stuff like that. What I decided to talk about was my PhD thesis, which was here. So being a gambler, I decided to try something more than a little bit edgy. So this was a day back in the sort of AI lab when they were coming up with all these complicated AI things for understanding human perception. And I came up with an idea that said, no, it's just completely elegantly simple. It was not a popular idea, I will tell you that. But I figured, you know, I had some beautiful math. Nobody could really understand it. I think my thesis readers didn't actually read it. But it was cool, and we got to the sort of thesis defense, you know, because they didn't know what else to do with me, frankly. You know, I had to harass them, but they eventually sort of put me out there. Now, by chance, Deborah had a big computer vision program going, and they had a meeting in the same building at the same time, which I did not know. But what that meant was they got done with their meeting, and there was everybody in the entire field in the world at my thesis defense. It was like, holy shit. If I blow this is really bad. Now, in my thesis committee, there were a couple of MIT faculty and a guy I'd never met. But he was the founder of this computer vision field. And I had heard he's a little weird. And so I was like waiting for this guy to come in. And saw this guy coming down the hall. Looked like Rumpelstiltskin. I mean, this is among the ugliest men I've ever seen in my life. He had a fake ear, a very obviously fake ear. But he was famous. And I said, "Sir, glad to meet you. Thank you for coming." And he said, "I think your thesis has a very serious error," did not shake my hand, and went into the room. So, everybody in the world's going to see this. This guy is like, this is a thesis committee member. He's just not a random guy, right? What do? Well, you know, if you're a gambler, you sort of say, well, I'll put my chips on the table, and somebody doubled them for me, and then doubled them again. But you know, life's a gamble. If I lose, I will go like work at McDonald's or something. It's not the end of the world. I'll find something else. So I went in, I decided that the best defense was a good offense. And I went in there and I sung it, and it's interesting because the guy who said, "I think there's a serious problem," did not say a word the whole time. He just said, "Okay," and left. And signed it. It's all good, right? So I thought I was going to fail. It was like right up against the wall. But, you know, I go into a sort of shock, actually, at that point. Because, you know, you're gambling. You just got to stay calm. You don't get emotional. You don't think about it. You do your plan, right? Turned out, however, that when I tried to publish the thesis, he was right. There was a mistake. Buried deep in that math, there was a degeneracy, which meant instead of this elegant thing that solved the problem beautifully, it was a statistical estimator. So here I am. I got this shiny degree, got a brand new job, right? Depends on all this. And I fucked up. Bad. But I thought, look, you know, I've done all these experiments. Something's got to happen. I mean, something's in there someplace, right? So again, think about it being from a gambler point of view. So that's a huge fail. But from a gambler point of view, you know what you're doing is you're placing your bets. You're going to lose them. If you make big bets, you lose big. If you make little bets, of course you lose because you're never going to win big, right? I've been making big bets. So quite possibly it's going to lose. But I had this evidence, these experiments that I'd done, and so I went back to the math. This is one of the like sort of Zen, absolutely calm things too. Again, maybe you think of it as a state of shock or something like that. But you know, when the pressure's on, you stay calm, you stay focused, you get it done. There's time for feelings, there's times for other things later when you're not about to be killed, okay? And I discovered that there was a really simple formulation, almost embarrassingly simple, that I could use to describe this. And so I said, Instead of having like all this beautiful math and like all this MIT stuff, right? You know, I'm just going to publish a paper that says I did these experiments with this really embarrassingly simple thing, and surprise, it works, right? So I recovered from the fail by not getting emotional, not like freaking out, not just, you know, sort of focusing on, okay, what's the recovery I can do? Think of it again like your investment. When you make investments, you lose some. You want to have a plan B, you want to think about, you know, how you're going to spread those investments around. So sometimes they go south, right? Worked out okay. You know, that paper today has 500 citations. It's like super good. And the beautiful math, I figured out a way to publish that too. Turns out it didn't apply in the areas that I was thinking it applied, but applied in another area. And that was a pretty good paper too. But you know, if I had freaked out at any of those points, I would never have gotten there. Right? And that's why I like this gambler song, right? It's like, look, I fail all the time. Things don't work. If you don't try things, you won't fail. If you try something that's interesting, you will fail. And you may fail most of the time. But sometimes you win big. So what that says to me is that everything you do is a bet. Everything. You may think, and MIT tries to sort of convince you of this, that things are like, you know, step by step, right? You know, you do this course, you get that grade, you get that certificate, and that's progress, and you're going up the ladder. No, you're putting money on the table in a particular direction. You're making bets that things will work out the way you want, and they may not. They may not work out in ways that you can't control. You are not in control. All you can do is place bets. And so you place bets, it is incumbent on you to know how much you're betting, what the odds are, but most importantly, to know where you're going. What do you want to get? What's the pot? What's the win that you want at the end? Is it worth what you're spending? Is it worth stomach churning? Because it does hurt, right? Is it worth the pain that you're going through to get there? So when I have students come to me, right, when I start them off, I ask them, what do you want to do in 5 years? Where do you want to go? And how much scar tissue are you willing to put up with? Because that's the coin of the realm. You know, you're going to do things, you are going to fail, people are going to call you an idiot, people are going to say all sorts of things about you, but you're going to win if you place your bets in a smart way, and if you place good bets, bets that are interesting, right? Don't get all, you know, conservative and place little tiny bets and play it safe. If you play it safe, you are going to lose, guaranteed. The only thing to do is to bet big, know that you're worth it, and try and play the odds as well as you can. Over time, you will learn how to play the odds better. That's this learning from failure. People say this all the time. I think it's BS. But if you think of it as like it's a betting existence, right? You're gambling. You do learn the odds better over time. You can see that, right? Sometimes it's a painful way to learn. But as you get better at the odds, you get better able to place the big bets. And it's hard, just, you know. But go in that with eyes open, and it doesn't hurt as much. You don't freak out. And I think that's the thing I decided to tell you, because you're going to face a thesis too. And you're going to screw up too, okay? And you can pull it out, just as I managed to in one way or another. Okay? That's it.
Sandy Pentland, everybody. Thank you so much, Sandy. We have some fails to share with you. I'm just going to do a quick one. I was asked to babysit by my parents to look after my little sister. We were playing hide and seek. She hid in a closet. I decided to lock her up in the closet to see how long she would notice, before she noticed. And I got a phone call and she was in there for an hour. That's a good one. Thank you for sharing that. As a little sister, I'm a little bit offended, but it's all right, it's all right. I have one more for you. My friend agreed to proofread my resume. As a joke, I put it into Comic Sans before I emailed it to him, and then I forgot to change it back before I emailed it to the recruiter. That's a deep tragedy. Okay. When I asked our next speaker what her power song would be, she said Chumbawamba's Tub Thumping. So please welcome Muriel Medard.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. So I have to say, when I first was asked to do this, I very enthusiastically said yes. I mean, you know, failures, I had such a rich set of choices to pick from. And then I also started thinking, because part of Francesca's very kind invitation was, you have been highly recommended for this. So I shall not disappoint. But anyway, as time grew nigh, I have to say I was really worrying about what I was going to say more and more, and at some point I thought this was maybe going to be more a demonstration than a narrative. But I'm going to share with you, you know, a pretty spectacular failure, a pretty spectacular failure, not just a short-term setback, you know, really a massive, well-documented screw-up. Let me start off with, you know, tub thumping and the reason why that was my song. So when I was a kid and a teenager, I used to go riding, and I had a just, you know, incredibly intense riding instructor, Madame de Volz, and she would make you get up on the horse no matter what. And if the horse had refused the obstacle, say I had gone over the obstacle just without the horse beneath me or something like that, which I thought was, that's okay, you know, the horse did get me over the obstacle, technically. She would make you get up. And she would always say, you cannot let the horse learn that it can refuse the obstacle. I dislocated my shoulder one time, she made me get up. I blacked out one time, she made me get up. This was the 80s, this was France, we just didn't know about lawsuits or, you know, liability or anything like that. So, you know, she just made you get up, and that was it, because you could not let the horse learn that it could refuse the obstacle. Okay, fast forward to some amount of time. I've done my PhD, I'm working at Lincoln Lab, and I'm trying to figure out what to do next. And my very dear friend, Andrea Goldsmith at Stanford, said, you know, why don't you go into academia? Now, as background, I come from a family of academics, and I had decided I was definitely not an academic because I was normal. And I was very proud of this, and I was going to have a normal life. And when my advisor was asking me as I was graduating what I wanted to do, and he asked me, are you interested in academia? My answer was, absolutely not. Look at your job. Why would I want that? But thank you, because I was well brought up also in that family of academics to say thank you. So here I am going into academia. I have you know, mixed feelings about it. Not because I don't like the research and supervising students, but really, you know, this wasn't what I had set out to do. So I'm starting in University of Illinois. This is late 90s. And, you know, I'm eager. I want to at least show that I can do well. Now, I have a few things that are not going for me. I have one very young daughter. I had my first daughter in grad school. I'm pregnant. I am moving to a new place. My house there is not ready, so I'm really living out of a construction site. And my daughter's asked me, why is it that in Illinois one does not have a kitchen and one washes the dishes in the bathtub? My husband at the time is gone every week all week, so I'm by myself. And I'm told that I have to teach, that I have a teaching assignment. Now, I'm told this in August, and classes start in August. And I'm thinking, okay, no problem, I can do the move, and I can move into this, you know, construction site with the bathtub where you can wash children and dishes, sometimes simultaneously. You know, I'm also teaching a very, very large class, which is a quasi-required class for graduate students because it's one of the qualifying classes for the PhD. And by the way, you know, this class is an absolute killer, and the students hate it. I'm like, no, that's great. I can do this. This should be good. And by the way, the class starts at 8:30. And that should be no problem. But remember, I'm by myself, and my daughter's school starts at 8:15. And I'm thinking, you know, I look on the map. I'm like, I can make from her school to the classroom. And, you know, given, okay, I have a little bit more drag because I'm getting more and more pregnant, but, you know, I can do this. No, this should be no problem. I've got this. All right. So here I am. I'm going to start my class. I ask my colleagues, well, you know, where are the materials? I said, oh, I think somebody has some notes. And there's a book. Now, when somebody told me it was a book, I thought, oh, this is great. This is fantastic. Because, as it so happens, when I was a student, if there was a book, I generally didn't go to class. I just read the book. So I thought this is great because, you know, if they're like me, they probably don't go to class. They'll just read the book. This should be a cakewalk. Don't do this, by the way, because then otherwise you end up like me, as I'm going to describe. You know, do go to class, please. So I think, okay, I show up in class, and I discover that the person who was rumored by other people to have notes did have notes, but these notes were more like reminders to himself of what was covered. So, you know, each lecture was maybe like half a page of don't forget to tell them about blah. But there was nothing before. So here I am. I basically have no notes. I have a book, and I have this class of people who are first-year graduate students in a class that's required for them to qualify for the doctoral program. And I'm a brand new instructor, and I have a completely unreasonable expectation of what it means to teach at this level, and I'm trying to teach the way I would have liked to be taught, which, remember, was actually not going to class. So basically, the class was a disaster. Let me just give you one vignette. I decided that since everybody reads the book, of course, rather than, you know, lecture on a particular thing, I would tell them to read the book, and I noticed with glee and a little bit of you know, nasty satisfaction that there was a mistake in the proof in the book. So I thought, why don't you guys look for the proof mistake, and then we'll discuss it in class. It flew like a lead balloon. Nobody could find the mistake because, of course, nobody knew the material, which was the reason I actually was supposed to teach it in the first place. The TA left, absconded with all the homeworks. I had a student who was deeply emotionally disturbed and would talk to himself loudly in the class, and I didn't know how to manage it. Basically, the class was just going from disaster to disaster to disaster, and my teaching evaluations told of this disaster. Okay, so at the end of the term, I thought, okay, that was the reason I didn't want to go into academia, and I thought it was because I was normal, but actually I probably shouldn't have gone into this because clearly I stink at this teaching thing. Now, you know, to give you more context, you know, my mother was a professor. She was a history professor, and, you know, she was an excellent teacher. I remember going to her lectures even as a child, and it was fascinating. It was captivating. Of course, you know, she had ancient Egypt and all that stuff. My father was an education inspector. I mean, literally, he would go to schools and see how people taught. So everybody around me taught, and taught well. And I couldn't clearly teach, you know, a first-year graduate course of the most basic kind. Afterwards, I sat down and I looked at the list of failures, and I noticed there were several things, and I think this is what I learned. Just look at it and just divide and conquer, right? Because it just felt overwhelming. There was so much stuff that had gone wrong. First thing is I should have said no. I wasn't going to teach that term. I wasn't ready. I was just moving in. Second of all, if I couldn't get to that class on time, I should have either made a different arrangement, or I should have told my my department so. Thirdly, I should have not counted on just there being notes somewhere, and I should have learned how to teach. And I took that to heart. I actually signed up at the School of Education, and I signed up for a one-year course to teach. So I went to the School of Education, and I sat, and I took notes, and I learned how to teach. Because I didn't know how to teach, and I reminded myself that, my father used to teach how to teach. So this was something you could learn, like anything else. I also figured out that I shouldn't have just tried to ignore that the TA had absconded. I should have gone to headquarters, I should have dealt with it, and I should have gone a new TA rather than trying to manage it on my own. I shouldn't have let the poor student who was clearly disturbed and in need of help just, sit there and basically be in pain in front of me. I should have intervened early on and tried to get him help. And when my colleagues couldn't advise me to how to get him help, I should have gone to medical and gotten him help. All these different things that seemed to accumulate one on top of the other were actually separable items that individually were manageable. And I think once I realized they were all individually manageable, and I could have managed them differently and not just felt like they were all piling up on top of me and probably constructively interfering so that, each, as opposed to having 1 + 1 be 2, it's like, 4 or something like that, I could have dealt with it. And therefore, I took that very much to heart. It would be nice to say in some sort of glib, facile way that, I had all these fantastic epiphanies and I never made those mistakes. You do repeat mistakes, but not as much. You learn. So you learn certain things, you start falling into those again of trying to manage everything by yourself, trying not to say no. And you keep correcting yourself. And trying to sort of separate these things and deal with them individually. So sometime later, I was actually, thinking again of Madame de Volz. By the way, I made her sound like she was a monster. She wasn't. One time I got hit really badly by a horse, and she did seem genuinely concerned. But I realized when she kept telling me that it was about not teaching the horse that it could refuse the obstacle, it really wasn't about the horse. It was about me. I should not learn to refuse the obstacle. You have to keep at it. And of course, the first thing that she would do when you would get back on the horse was to talk, what did you just do wrong? And she would divide all the different aspects of having to go across the obstacle and separate them, make them into manageable pieces, and deal with each of them separately, triage the things that hadn't gone wrong, the things that had gone wrong, deal with them individually, separately. Each of them was manageable, and keep getting back on the horse. So that's it. That is my story. Thank you.
That was Muriel Medard, everybody. Thank you, Muriel. I have a couple of fails. For you. Well, first of all, I want to bring up that when we did this event in the spring, someone submitted a fail, and it was that they'd gone for a job interview. This was an MIT student. And in the job interview, they had forgotten the formula V = IR. So that got this hysterical reaction. And I remember as I read it out thinking, I don't remember what that formula is. And so it's been a long time since I did high school physics, but as that was quite a terrible fail, I should remember that. I just want to sort of say, wherever she is in the world, to my high school physics teacher, Miss Sheward, I'm really sorry. I should remember that. This fail is in the vein of letting a teacher down. So this person said, I fell asleep in a class of more than 500 people. Of course, this is the class where the professor decides he needs a volunteer, and he says he wants the person who fell asleep in class. Everyone pointed at me, so I woke up, but it was still half in my dream and definitely fell down the stairs as I headed towards the professor. Everybody knew me then. Thank you for sharing that. Right. So our next speaker tonight is Mira Wilczek, and when I asked her what her power song is, she said it is the Karate Kid theme song. Please welcome Mira Wilczek.
Thank you. All right. So I got invited to speak here, and I was feeling like, oh man, I'm starting to get famous. This is a forum with George Church and Sandy Penland and Jonathan Menard, and you know, my name is starting to be thrown around in the sort of same echelon as these great luminaries of the community. I'm so excited to just talk about my companies and all the successes that I've had, and then it became clear what the theme of the thing was, and I was like, yeah, I've got some good stories there too. So thank you for the invite. This is a really great event because I think we don't talk about this kind of stuff enough, and it becomes very scary, and it becomes something where people are afraid of being associated with failures, when being associated with failures is almost as important as being associated with successes, because those failures inform what comes next in your life. So I'm going to talk about how my startup failed. And when I characterize it that way, you may think I'm bitter about it, but I'm actually not. The reason I'm not bitter about it is because I've had many startups succeed. I sold a semiconductor company for 12x to investors in about 3 years. I now run an incubator. We just had our first IPO earlier this year. We're expanding to 30 concurrent companies, and we're all very excited about all of them. I'm on 3 boards of 3 of our companies and a founder on 5 of them. But I'm not going to talk about any of that. I'm going to talk about what happened on my personal timeline here, which is that I started this company and sold it, and that was great. And then there's a secret little niche right here where I spent about 3 months working on an idea that did not work out. And it did not work out because I made some fundamental mistakes in how I approached it, how I set it up from the very beginning. And I'm going to tell you about that. All right, why do startups fail? What are the most common reasons? Number one, there is no market need. So 42% of all startups that fail because there's no market need. Who can guess another one? Team, that is a good one. What else? Money, yes, you've named the top 3 reasons. All right. The number 2 reason, 29% of all startups that fail are at least in part because they just run out of money. People don't care enough about their idea, whether it's investors, whether it's the customers. They run out of money before they actually achieve critical mass. And yes, the third most common reason why startups fail is that they assemble the wrong team. I made this slide, and then I realized that actually this is an awesome team. In fact, you might call them an A team. But I didn't want to give up on the idea, so this is kind of, you know, it's like you think you're assembling the A team, but it's kind of off-brand. And it doesn't really work the way that you were hoping it might. So this is actually the hardest one to get right, and spoiler alert, this is exactly how my startup went wrong. Before I talk about the specifics of my abject failure, it's probably useful to frame the story. So the idea behind the startup was I had just gotten off of a very successful series of engagements with DARPA, and they were very excited to fund the next thing that I wanted to work on. And I had a background right out of school of working as a hacker, an ethical hacker. Basically what happened was I served out my earnout in my previous startup, and I pitched to them an idea for how to determine when somebody who is not actually the owner of a device picks up that device and starts using it. Because as people were at the time starting to hook up more and more of their actual sensitive accounts, including their DoD asset accessing accounts. It becomes vital to be able to actually in real time assess whether the person who's interacting with something is, continues to be the person who actually owns that device and actually has authorization to use it. So DARPA gave us money, which is great. If we go back to those 3 reasons why startups are likely to fail, we look at whether or not there was a market need. We actually had a bunch of customers lined up, and in fact, there's a company today that I advised very early in their history called BioCache that is doing almost the exact same thing as the startup that I started that failed, and is getting a lot of traction, not just with the defense industry, but also with banking institutions, and they currently are monitoring more than 6 billion transactions a day for potential signs of fraud. So this is a good validation that there actually is a market here and a good validation of the fundamental premise of this business. So wasn't that very most common mode of failure? Did we run out of money? No, because DARPA was very gracious, and my goodness, that came out huge. Almost as huge as the check they wrote us. No, it wasn't that big a check. But they did give us enough of a check that we were able to get off the ground and actually build a working prototype and pilot it with several customers. And what was even better about it was that was non-dilutive funding. If anybody is considering startup life, that is better than gold because that means that you get money and you don't have to give them anything really, including equity. So that was great. And so that was phenomenal. So we had a lot of runway, and we had sort of a lead customer. So somebody who could tell us whether we were on the right track with something, or and be a very sort of demanding voice in the room when it came to is what we're building actually useful or not. The team. This is actually where it went wrong. So when you're thinking about putting together a startup team, there are many things that are absolutely vital to making it successful. Do you have complementary skills? Is everybody actually bringing something to the table where they can contribute fully? Do people work together effectively? And are people fully committed? Especially in the early stages of a startup, you're talking about somebody who you're going to spend 80, 90 hours a week with. This is somebody who is going to be in your very, very inner circle of trust, somebody you're probably going to spend more time with than your spouse, at least for a time. And somebody that you need to make sure that you have an absolutely fantastic working relationship with, and somebody who's going to be as invested as you are in making that thing successful, even if, for example, a server literally catches on fire because a uninterruptible power source decides to explode and set off the sprinklers. Just a random example, I don't know why that would ever happen. You need that person to be in their car, driving out to the data center, taking it out, re-racking it on a different floor, and be be on deck at 3 a.m. to go and make sure that everything comes together. So there are many sort of vital elements in picking a co-founding team and assembling a co-founding team, and the source of my failure here was that I picked the wrong co-founder. Wasn't actually Tom Hanks. I'm sure he would have been great. So the reason why I'm putting a picture of Tom Hanks up here is because my co-founder is actually a really awesome guy. Do we agree that Tom Hanks is a really awesome guy? Does anyone have anything against Tom Hanks? Oh, okay. All right, just an extra vote of confidence for Tom Hanks. So it's because my co-founder was actually a really awesome guy. He was somebody who I actually knew from very early in my career, who I had worked with before, not very closely, but I knew that he was. I knew that he was a good guy. I knew that he had a wonderful family, and I knew that everybody he worked with spoke very highly of him. I knew that he had a great depth of operational experience. So he actually ran sort of a global organization of network operating centers that managed over 600 employees on 24/7 shifts and operating center around the globe. Great operational experience, and also a fantastic Rolodex of people who he'd interacted with in his previous roles at various customers who had been looking to him as sort of their subject matter expert for identifying security breaches, and had sort of come to come to see him as somebody who they could invest in responsibly and feel as though he was going to deliver on whatever representations that he made. So this was all great. And yeah, as I said, we had worked together before, and we had got along pretty well. So I recruited him to come join me as my co-founder, and gave him a lot of equity, and said, all right, it's time to get serious here. DARPA contract starts on September 1st. It's time to quit your job and move out to Boston, like we agreed. And he said, I'll quit my job. But notice what's missing. He didn't want to actually move. When the time came, he wasn't all in. Has anybody here heard of Dunbar's number? This is, yes? No? I'm getting a giggle, but not a, okay. So this is essentially a recognition and a characterization of the fact that throughout history, as anthropologists have been, have had enough data in order to actually, make observations, the number of people who are in various classes of intimacy with any individual has actually stayed relatively steady. So even today with Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat and whatever kids are using these days, people have about 150 acquaintances, which is the one that people pull out the most. This is people who you have some level of interaction with, maybe on the order of like once every month or once every 2 months. So this is probably like a couple of your high school friends, a bunch of your friends from college, and whatever. But it actually scales down, and you have about 5 really intimate friends. These are people who if you have an emergency, you're sleeping on their couch, and you probably are in their wedding, and probably one of you is godparenting the other's kid. And part of the reason why this actually tends to be relatively fixed proportions across human history is that humans have a certain bandwidth of communication and a certain bandwidth of processing, and when it comes, and they also have a certain amount of time. And when it comes time to actually form relationships and maintain relationships, you can only squeeze in so much. So if you're investing X amount in one relationship, you just don't have that much to invest in 150 other random people. I bring this up because when you are choosing a co-founder, you are essentially choosing at least one of your 5. If you're choosing multiple co-founders, you're probably choosing at least a couple of your 5s. This is somebody who you're going to live with, eat with, breathe with, which is kind of gross, hopefully not sleep with. Yeah, don't do that. But this is somebody who you are going to, as I said, you're probably going to spend more time with this person than your spouse. And it is very, very important that you understand that commitment when you are saying, I'm going to spend my next 5, 10 years of my life working on this thing with you, my partner. Are we in it together? Let's go. You need to be best friends. So you need those little necklaces, and that should actually probably be part of the founding documents that you sign at the beginning. Should be you take a little heart and you break it into 5 pieces if you have 5 co-founders, and that's what you do. All right, it's hard to do that from across the country. I resisted the temptation of, since I brought up Tom Hanks, I resisted the temptation of putting Sleepless in Seattle poster up here, but then I told you about it anyway, so I don't know if that really counts as resisting temptation. So we were on opposite coasts, and we genuinely tried to make it work for a while. So we set up a remote teleconference that we left on all the time. 8 to 10 hours a day. He flew out 1 week a month, and we genuinely tried to make it work, but it just, the bandwidth of communication, despite our best efforts, just wasn't high enough. Our priorities got misaligned. We started diverging in the vision that we had for the company, and fundamentally, it became clear that what we were each trying to build was not the same thing, so we weren't building the same thing together. At some point, you got to rip off the Band-Aid. The best thing about this particular fail is that essentially exactly as soon as we identified it wasn't working. We both agreed that it wasn't working, and we walked away clean. So if I could leave you with one thing that went really, really well about this failure, it was that if you have decided that something has failed, don't stick with it. Move on. Figure out what you're going to do next, and sort of move on with your life. Because the only thing that you don't, if you're a gambler and you're placing chips on the table, you can always find more chips, but you can't actually find more time. You are, until the singularity happens, you're a person, you don't get the time back. Another couple good things. We had money, so that was great. We actually just sort of split it up, and we're both happy. The other really nice thing was that because our only funding source was customers and DARPA, we didn't have any outside investors, so we didn't have any outside stakeholders who we really had to make sure that we were treating responsibly. So that was actually a really nice thing, and something that I hadn't been consciously planning for at the time, but I actually now, when I'm starting a new company, think about if this goes sour, who are going to be the stakeholders left holding the bag, and how badly is it going to hurt them? Like if this does have to unwind, how is that going to happen, and how are we going to be responsible to the people who are placing their confidence in us? I also had maintained actual control over the company. So sometimes people start companies and they're just like, oh, there's 4 of us, we'll each get 25% of the equity, and whatever. God bless you if you can make that work. That has never worked for me. Having a clear final decision maker is absolutely key, just so that things don't turn into long, drawn-out fights. As long as that person is trustworthy and fiduciary, take their fiduciary responsibility seriously, it's really great to just sort of centralize final decision making. And obviously, the thing that I took away the most from this is to really test the commitment of somebody before you invest a lot of yourself in them. Now I really like to see people who have potentially even done startups together before, potentially have worked together for 3 years before they actually, in some other setting, before they actually go off to start a company. Potentially people who have been roommates and have done great things together. People who are committed to each other, and people who have really sort of been through the crap with each other is really a great recipe for having a strong founding team. And I'm going to say there are plenty of fish in the sea. You're going to think that I'm talking about my co-founder, but I'm actually talking about ideas. There are actually plenty of ideas. There are plenty of potential companies out there. Anybody who's in this room, anybody who's at MIT, period, and also anybody especially who's thinking actively about not just the best case scenario, but also what can happen along the way, is somebody who's going to recognize that they are a continual fount of ideas. This is not going to be, if you have something that you're excited about and it doesn't work out for some reason, something else is going to excite you tomorrow. So don't be afraid of this being your only thing that you have to offer the world. There are plenty of idea fish in the sea. And don't found companies with Tom Hanks. That's it.
That was Mira Wilczek, everybody. I kind of wanted the A-team to stay up there while I was talking, but also Mira just proved that Tom Hanks is good in everything, even a PowerPoint. So that was pretty something. I have some more fails for you. Someone in this room went on a cross-country bike trip, but whenever there was rain, dogs, excessive heat, or they didn't get enough sleep, they drove the support vehicle. So actually what happened was they went on a cross-country car trip. What else have I got? Oh, we have one that's very local to this evening. Does anyone have a squeaky chair? Yeah, you do. So someone in this room actually purchased WD-40 specifically for the fail event. And then they totally forgot it at home. So squeak away. And thank you for squeaking. Our next speaker this evening is Deborah Blum. And when I asked her the name of her power song, she said it is Go Wherever You Want to Go by Patty Griffin. Please welcome Deborah Blum.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here, and my story is really a story about failure and reinvention, which starts when I'm very young. So I'm the daughter of a scientist. I'm a science journalist, but my father was an entomologist and chemical ecologist, and I'm one of his 4 daughters, about which he was only slightly bitter. We never realized how bitter he was until my youngest sister was born, and he told everyone she was a boy named George. And for all of her life, he called her Gorgeous George, just to make up to her. But the other thing about my dad is that no matter who we were or who we wanted to be, he really wanted all of us to grow up to be scientists. All of us had to take all the math and science in high school, and he constantly was sort of hinting around about this. Other little girls got dolls for Christmas. We got chemistry sets. Other families had flowers in the middle of their dining room table. We had a tarantula. He was studying tarantulas. It was in a plexiglass box, but it was a striking table ornament. And actually, when I was at the University of Georgia as a journalism student, he brought me a tarantula as a housewarming present, which I actually had at that apartment for 3 years. And I actually was the one daughter that he thought was going to turn out a scientist. I loved chemistry. I loved it in high school. I had an amazing chemistry teacher. And so when I started in college, I started at the Florida State University as a honors science major with a specialization in chemistry. And I loved the class, absolutely loved the chemistry class. And I was such a nerd about this that there was one semester that I even embroidered all my blue jeans with atomic orbital patterns because I was so excited that particular semester about atomic orbitals. And the only problem was that then I actually had to go to a lab. And in the lab, it was a whole different story for me because I would get into the lab and I was just never one of those people who was entirely in the moment in the laboratory, which you have to be. So I would be sitting there. There was one experiment we did where we were creating crystals and they would analyze them for the impurities. And I would literally be looking at these crystals and think, oh, that dark one, it looks very sinister. I wonder if it's like the villain of the story. And I start making up stories about the crystals, and pretty soon my whole thing would boil over. And so in a single semester, I generated a toxic cloud and forced an evacuation of the lab. And really, I have always thought I should have married this postdoc, but one day I'm sitting there, I'm working away. I have long braids at the time, and I'm working away on some particular experiment, and Frank, I still remember his name, the postdoc comes up and he goes to me, Deborah, do you smell smoke? I looked down and my braids are on fire in the Bunsen burner. I had not even noticed this, right? And they're like singeing away. So at that point, I went back to my dorm. I call my dad, right? I'm like, I don't think I want to be a chemistry major anymore. I was really, and I said to him, I'm just afraid that either I or someone else is going to be dead by the end of the semester. It became clear that this did not worry my father that much. He clearly felt that even if I went up with a fireball, I would have upheld the family honor by remaining a chemist. And so we had this standoff conversation. My braids are still crumbling at the ends. I'm on the phone. And he finally says to me, well, you know, you could become a theoretical chemist. And I'm like 18 years old, you know, with my hair barely stopped smoking. I'm like, no, I'm never going to do that. I don't want to be it. And my father was so disappointed, right? I mean, there was no, okay, go do what you want to do. It was clearly that I had failed. And that was part of it for me, but the other part of it for me is I didn't know what I wanted to be if I wasn't going to be a chemist. Everything about what I wanted to do was to become a chemist, and now I am standing there alone in this hallway with my father, having almost hung up on me because he was so upset with me, thinking, I have no idea what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. And so I kind of drifted through the rest of that semester until finally I thought, okay, well, I have to do something. And I also like to write. I'm the kind of person who makes up stories about crystals in the laboratory, and I like to get paid. I'm very pragmatic. And so I'll go into journalism, whatever that is, because I can be a writer and I can get paid. That's the way it works. And so I switched over to the University of Georgia, which has a very good journalism school. And I was terrible when I started. I joined the college newspaper, and when I started, there was one point where they would use the first story I ever did for the Red and Black as an example of how not to be a journalist, right? I mean, I was really bad, but the other thing I was very stubborn. And I also learned to really love sharing stories and getting behind the scenes with stories. How does something work? Journalism is always about how does this work? Does it work correctly? Who can help me figure out how it works? And I loved that. I absolutely loved it. And also, which is probably part of my personality, I really don't like to be told no. And journalism is an exercise in getting around no. You'd be amazed at the number of people, and I know it will surprise you, who don't want to talk to journalists, right? And so your job as a journalist, because they're an central part of the story you want to tell, is to find a way to get them to tell you these things. How do you do that? There's like amazing, we have conversations about this in the profession. And I loved that puzzle. And I loved learning how to get around no's. And I liked taking stories and giving voices to people who had no voice. And letting people into worlds that they didn't see, because the one thing I learned very on as a journalist is that what you read in the paper, is always only part of the story, but that most people don't experience all these different things that you do as a journalist. So I was a journalist in the South for 5 years. I was a general assignment reporter, and then I realized, this is part 2 of where failure led me, that I did not want to rattle around cops and courts and all the beats I'd done, and I wanted to write about science, which was what I cared about. So I had learned that I could reinvent myself, and this is really about the power of learning to reinvent yourself. I had reinvented myself. I was going to be a chemist. Now I was going to be a journalist. Now I was going to be a science journalist. I got zero support from this idea, zero. My editor at the St. Petersburg Times in Florida told me that I was throwing a good career away on a fad. And my father, bless his heart, as we say in Georgia, my father was horrified, right? Because he was afraid I would interview his friends. And that was the first thing he said to me, okay, if you have to do this, you have to do this, but you can't interview any of my friends because that would be totally embarrassing. And so I quit my job before I was even in grad school. I was so sure I could make this work. I had come to believe in myself and my ability to reinvent myself, and so I cold quit my job in St. Pete, waited to get into grad school, and this will show you how confident I was at this point. I had applied to Berkeley because my boyfriend was in California. And then one of the people who wrote me a letter of recommendation said to me, well, you should apply to the University of Wisconsin, which is where he was from. And I thought, okay, maybe I'll apply to 2 schools. And so I applied to Wisconsin, and I got a full ride at Wisconsin, and that was where I ended up going. And so I got a degree in science journalism at Wisconsin, was hired by McClatchy Newspapers in California, was the first environment writer at the Fresno paper, and then the first science writer at the Sacramento paper. So now I'm inventing it as I go. Literally, people have no idea what to do with a science writer. They've never had one. They've never even seen the Sacramento Bee's specialty is sports and politics. People couldn't even figure out how to give me an assignment. I mean, this is an amazing opportunity, right? When you're in this situation where no one even thinks you're of worth to where you are, the ability to invent it where you are. So I literally invented science writing at the Sacramento Bee. And I did what you get to do as a science writer, write about everything that interested me. And newspaper science writing is a wonderful thing. So the last two major projects I did an investigation of nuclear weapons design and deception by the Department of Energy, which actually got a particular program shut down by the General Accounting Office. And then I did a series on ethical issues in primate research, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 1992. And that was a study in stubbornness, frankly, getting that done. I used to tell people when I was working on it I would win the Pulitzer for aggravation, because it was so hard to get anyone to tell me anything. And that became my first book. And then I got a second book contract, and then the University of Wisconsin hired me back as a professor of practice, which leads me back to being a theoretical chemist. So I did all the job interviews, and I interviewed last with the dean of the College of Letters and Sciences at UW-Madison. And he said, why did you become a science writer? I said, well, and I tell him the story, the hair on fire, right down to, my whole rejection at 18 of theoretical chemistry. And he said, you can see this coming. I'm a theoretical chemist, after I've just said that no one would do that because it's the most boring profession in the world. And so what do you do, and speaking of failures, what do you do in that kind of situation when you're applying for a job and you tell the person who makes the ultimate decision that his profession is boring? I started laughing. I just completely burst out laughing. It was the perfect response in that situation. I'm not saying it would have been for everyone, but this guy then started laughing. Everyone else in the room is looking at us, and we were both just howling. It was the most ridiculous situation. And so for years later, he would call me out. He actually wrote letters to the newspaper about me and how wonderful I was, I think he just loved that I'd had a sense of humor about the whole thing and that I wasn't afraid. And so now I have been a failed chemistry major, I've been a police reporter, I've been a science writer, I'm a university professor with an endowed chair with a master's degree. My father, again, was astonished by that. I had a full professorship with an endowed chair at the University of Wisconsin. And so I've reinvented myself again, right? Who am I at this point? And then I finally said to myself, and now I want to go back to chemistry. So I still think of chemistry what I thought of it when I was 18 years old, that it's beautiful, that it's the most fascinatingly intricate, fundamental explanation of how things work, and that it's occasionally sinister. And so that was all in my mind when I sold a book called Poisoner's Handbook, which looks at the invention of forensic toxicology in the United States and follows a couple of very pioneering scientists as they try to figure out how to catch poisoners in 1920s New York. And that book ended up being a New York Times bestseller and was a PBS documentary and led to the book I just published last month, which is about another chemist, America's first great food safety chemist and the invention of food safety in the United States. So you see, I follow this complete arc, right? I kept chemistry in there. I kept love of journalism in there. I've put all of them together. I've reinvented myself as a book author. And the final thing, and this is going to lead me to my, I think my point, I hope my point, is that when I came here to MIT, I'm director of the Night Science Journalism program at MIT. That is not a position that is a professorship with an endowment. That's a staff position, right? And so when I left Wisconsin and walked away from an endowed chair to be a staff, which is a different thing at a university, as you know, a lot of my friends thought I was crazy. And I thought, I can see people nodding, you're crazy. And I thought two things. One is I had complete confidence in myself that it didn't matter if I was tenured or not, that I could make this work. And in the years that I've been here, I've founded a magazine. I've launched a program to train science editors. I am just launching a program. We got just this month, it's small by science standards, but we got about almost $500,000 in grants from 2 different foundations to run these training programs, right? So I want to tell you a couple of things that I've learned. I've made a lot of mistakes, and I've reinvented myself constantly, and when you do that, I'm going to be someone else. I'm going to take this chance on myself. You learn to be your own cheerleader. You learn to just have enough faith in yourself that when you step off that cliff edge and you're hanging in the air, you believe that you're going to make the landing. And that kind of faith in yourself that you only learn from mistakes and from taking chances on yourself and from reinventing yourself when things send you in a different direction will give you the confidence to do all kinds of exciting things. And I really believe that. And I see it in myself. I don't think I'm perfect at this, but I know that a lot of the things that I've done, the guy who edits the magazine we publish, he came to us from the New York Times, and he said the reason he signed on with me was that I was willing to roll the dice. And I remain, even at this stage of my career, I like to roll the dice and take a chance on things because I believe something interesting will come out of that. And I've learned from doing that by walking away from things, by making mistakes, by setting my hair on fire, right? All of those things have led me to here. And to the point that I want to say to you in the decisions I make now, and this is why I took the job here, life is short. Make a difference. If you don't make a difference, right, what's the point? Thank you.
That was Deborah Blum, everyone. Thank you, Deborah. It was just a line that Deborah said, that journalism is about getting around the word no, that I loved, and I'm going to steal, and I'll quote you, don't worry. We also had someone submit a fail as that talk was going on, saying that as a journalist myself, I'm still learning how to push people in the right way to get the information I need. And there's been an occasion where I felt after the fact that I could have got more information, but hesitation and anxiety got in the way. And I feel like we've all been there. There's all been those times where you wish you'd said something differently or handled something differently. I can tell you, I wish I'd not squeaked about keeping a chair clear to a strange woman on a plane, but that just felt very familiar to me. We have one more speaker, and then we're going to move into our Q&A session. Our last speaker tonight is George Church, and when I asked him for his power song, he told me it is Stop Making Sense by the Talking Heads. Please welcome George Church.
You might get the impression that that I like failure. I'm not fond of failure, actually. I think many of the people that are talking here probably were mystified why they were invited. I had no doubts. I'm quite a success at failure. I am in a book on failure. How many of you can say that? I mean, right? That's on my CV. My website has a copy of the letter where I flunked out of graduate school. I mean, I got it, not just flunking a class, but the whole thing. And that will be kind of the punchline of this. So I'm going to ruin the punchline by telling you at the beginning what it is. And I'm going to ruin it at the end by kind of explaining how I survived anyway. And I'll ruin it even more by saying, you know, almost all of my failures are really first world failures. You know, you know, flunking out of graduate school, I should be grateful that I was in graduate school at all. I made it that far. But it takes quite a bit of effort, I think. I worked really hard at building up to that failure, and I had a whole bunch of failures along the way so I could practice, get good at it. You know, it's like they say, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? It's you practice. You know, so I practiced, and I'll tell you some of those failures that led me to. And I wouldn't even say this is my biggest failure. This was probably the one that got me to this stage, was this flunking out of Duke and putting my letter on my internet site. So anyway, my failures began when I was born. You could tell it's going to be a Shaggy Dog story when somebody says that, right? I should have picked as my song Alice's Restaurant. I think that would have been a better choice, but I didn't have a lot of time to think about it. So anyway, when I was born, I had bad genes and a bad environment. Other than that, everything was good. Bad genes kind of slowly became evident. I'm not blaming my parents. The parents were terrific. Good genes, good nurturing. They were supportive, whatever I did, however misguided. But somewhere I managed to get genes for things like dyslexia, narcolepsy, ADD, OCD, both at once. How do you do that? And it had an impact. And then I was born in MacDill Air Force Base in Florida, and I kind of hung out in the mudflats of Florida where I wasn't really getting any kind of education whatsoever. We're not talking about, I not only was not getting an MIT education, I was really not, nobody around me really cared whether I was getting education or not. I'm sure my parents did, but again, they were great parents. But and this became evident as I went forward. I was constantly being put in remedial reading classes. At one point, I had to take a class at nighttime. So it was a night class, and I didn't even know night classes existed. I thought that this is just punishment that they restricted to the daytime. And I was in with a bunch of adults. They had decided to better themselves. I don't think they consider themselves failures. They were just going to get ahead, and they were taking speed reading. It was most of the class was speed reading, but they also had some remedial reading. That's what I was in. And I said, well, just for kick, I got bored quickly with the remedial reading. And I said, well, I'm going to take speed reading. And they had this little machine that would project onto the screen words really, really fast. They were subliminal. You could barely see them. And since I was by far the youngest person in this, first of all, I was amazed that there were people, adults that would, after a longer day at work than I was at school, they would come in and then they would take another class. And so anyway, I was looking at these things flashing, and since I was so young, I could speed read. And I say, wow, that's really great. I'm both in the remedial section and I'm in the speed reading session. And that went nowhere because I had to take another remedial reading class a few years later, and I kept having troubles. But that isn't what led to my flunking out of graduate school. No, that took more work than just having bad genes and a bad environment. So what I did was I was in a course, taking a summer course here at MIT in about 1973. I was just finishing up my very brief undergraduate career, my second year, and I was taking a course in quantum physics. And in my spare time, I said, gee, I've got a lot of spare time while I'm doing poorly in my quantum physics class. I should become a guinea pig in a nutrition study. So back then, MIT had a department of nutrition, which we don't have anymore, and they would do experiments on people. And I said, wow, this is great. I'll get free food all summer long. They're going to pay me some amazing amount of money, like $300, and I'll learn a little bit about nutrition. And so turned out the study that I was enrolled in, or the only one available at the time, was on leucine deprivation. Leucine, as some of you might know, you biochem nerds, is an essential amino acid, meaning it's essential for life for human beings. And if you don't get it, so they were trying to simulate kind of extreme protein deficiency you get in quasiocore. And the result is mental failure. And I said, I didn't really consider that in the whole balance sheet of free food versus destroying an otherwise promising brain. And so I'm doing this, and my quantum physics is going getting worse and worse during the summer. And it all culminates with me, by the end of the study, there's nobody else in the study other than me. I mean, everybody else had the good sense that, first of all, it tasted terrible. I mean, in order to get a leucine-deficient diet, you have to, there's no food that's missing leucine. I mean, every food has leucinous, you know. You can't avoid it. So they had to make powdered amino acids. And you may like some amino acids, you know, like MSG. Probably you all like MSG. But the rest of them, they're pretty bad, you know. So you eat this powder. There's no way to eat it. And then, of course, everything else you eat has to be semi-synthetic. So I was on, I think, what the anti-GMO people would consider their dream diet. It was a DNA-free diet. It was so synthetic, there was no DNA in the diet whatsoever. And there wasn't very much leucine either. So anyway, I managed to make it through that semester, that summer. And then I was the next year starting graduate school prematurely, I would say. I was infantile, very immature. And on top of that, I was brain damaged at this point. And so I started graduate school. And my first brilliant insight at the end of the summer was, I don't need to, I don't need to sleep, and therefore I don't need housing, so I will be homeless. Okay. Off to a great start at graduate school, right? And I was homeless for 6 months. I finally decided it was not such a great thing when I got influenza, and I didn't really have a place to stay. And so I eventually got a place to stay. But that was after 6 months of trying this homeless thing. By the way, I did the whole thing. I ate food that was left behind in the stadium after the football game, you know, and ate food out of the garbage, you know. I did the whole bit. So I'm not blaming this on the MIT nutrition department, by the way. So but the reason I'm so confident is that I had started research as an undergraduate just the year before, as a sophomore, and I was doing great, having a great time as a crystallographer. It brought together everything that I enjoyed doing, and so I just continued to do that. I did the crystallography research, but I didn't really quite get the point of the classes. I mean, I should have, because I'd been an undergraduate for a couple of years, and so I didn't go to classes. I was just doing research. And I would come in, and I wasn't even doing research particularly well, I mean, technically speaking. For example, one day I was in my bicycle cleats, and I decided I'm going to fetch some highly concentrated acid. And I said, well, I think I need 2 bottles of highly concentrated acid. And so I'm walking across this terrazzo floor in my bicycle cleats. I'm up in the air, and I'm down on the ground. And, you know, the bicycle cleats are not really made for working on slick floors. And of course, we're in a hospital research lab where they wax the floors every day. Anyway, I'm rolling around, and both bottles break. I'm rolling around on the ground, covered with acid. And I'm thinking, this doesn't look so good, you know? And so I go and I get cleaned up, and the next day I come in, I say, okay, I don't know if it's the next day, but soon thereafter I come in and I say, okay, I don't trust shoes anymore. I'm not going to wear shoes, okay? And to put this in perspective, my father, my genetic father, I had 3 fathers, my genetic father was known for not wearing shoes. He basically didn't wear shoes from the time he was 18 until he died when he was 83, except on rare occasions, which I think was walking in the door of his Air Force job, but then he took them off. And he even went to black tie affairs at the White House, I'm told, barefoot. But anyway, so I thought, I'll try what my father would recommend. And so I'm trying, I got really good grip, good traction on the ground. And then I walk into my lab, and I figured my lab is kind of like my home. I spend 100 hours a week there. I feel comfortable there. But this day is not my day because it's site visit day. And the chairman of our department has these distinguished guests, and they're all in suits and ties. And I walk in barefoot, my shorts, and I have no choice. I'm walking right straight through them. And so, okay, I'm endearing myself to my department chair at that point. He's probably heard about the acid as well by this time. And then I proceed to flunk a couple classes, which, conceivably, my professor, who was an assistant professor, which doesn't amount to much when it comes to throwing your weight around, and he weighed about 40 kilograms, by the way, so there wasn't much weight to throw around as well. And anyway, so there was no appeals process. I should mention that along the way, when I remember we had graduate advisors. It's not like they didn't care. We had graduate advisors that would mentor us. In addition to great mentoring I was getting from my advisor, who was Sung-Ho Kim. He was really excited about the research I was doing. And we had a graduate advisor who that was his main job. And so I would go in and sit at his desk opposite him, and he would be talking to me about graduate school. I think he had some kind of script or something. And meanwhile, I'm looking across his desk, past his head, and on his wall, right behind him, are photographs of graduate students. And you might think, wow, how sweet. He cares about the graduate students so much he has them right behind us. The problem was that half of the graduate students had big black Sharpie through their face. And I say, I could be one of those. And I was well on my way. And so anyway, I got this nice letter from them, suitable for framing. And so now comes the denouement part of the talk, where I ruin the punchline by explaining how I survived. So I'm a dropout. Some of my really good friends, the ones at the 5 at the on the left side of the are saying, well, maybe you should get professional help, or the letter said, you hope, we're sorry you failed in this field, but maybe there's some other field that you could succeed in. And so I decided I'm going to be a technician in the same lab. So I have a lot of inertia, undergraduate, graduate student, technician, all in the same lab. I figure this is a golden career opportunity. And I am a technician for about a year or something like that. And my advisor, my terrific advisor, Sung-Ho Kim, he takes me aside and he says, George, you're not a very good technician. you should apply to graduate school. I said, you got to be kidding me with my record? And he says, no, just humor it, just try it. And so I say, okay, I got to fail at least one more thing. I failed at being a graduate student, a technician. Now I can fail at reapplying. And so I applied to one university. That's bad. Don't recommend that. It's bad choice. I'm still making bad decisions at this point. And worse than that, it was not the easiest university in the world to get into. It was Harvard University. And I said, well, the worst that happens is I don't get in, and I get to stay as a technician for a while. Even though I'm a bad technician, he's not going to fire me at this. And I got in. And the question is, why did I get in, right? That's the part of the denouement, the deconstructing of this. And I don't know exactly why. No one told me. Nobody explained it. Nobody said, you're on probation, kid. We're taking you, but we don't want you. This is nothing like. It was just like a simple form letter. You're supposed to show up on this date. And so my rationalization is, I was a crystallographer. I had actually written 5 papers while I was flunking out. So that is concrete. I was a crystallographer, and they desperately needed crystallographers. Back then, it was really hard to do crystallography. You could spend 10 years on a thesis and not have much to show for it. And there were a bunch of labs suddenly needed it. So that might have helped, although they never said that. They never recruited me particularly to their labs. And I had gotten in before. I had said no to them before, so I figured, well, that probably endeared me to them. And so it was some combination of those things, and I got in, and I managed to take courses again, and managed to make it through. So, and I have to say that I am indebted to Harvard on multiple occasions. That was the first case. The second one, well, actually, it was the second time. The first time, they'd given me a summer job. The summer before the quantum physics course. And so that was their first. I don't know why they did that. Then I don't know why they let me in graduate school exactly. And then later, when I was a postdoctoral fellow, applying to become an assistant professor, so I'm a postdoctoral fellow in UCSF. I have absolutely no publications for my postdoctoral fellowship. It's cut short because I'm trying to get back to the East Coast to be with my girlfriend, who, by the way, is now my wife, and we've got 2 grandchildren, so that worked out. But anyway, I was trying to get back, and I didn't have much to show for my postdoc. So anyway, Harvard gave me an assistant professor position, and then the third time is I'm up for tenure, and I lose my major source of funding. And a little tenure tip for those of you is one of the main things that they use to judge you. It's not really publications. It's not popularity in your course. There's not even teaching a rigorous course. It's whether you could pay for yourself, right? And so I had clearly shown that I could not pay for myself. And nevertheless, they let me get tenure. So I'm indebted to them, and I'm indebted to you for listening to all of our failures. May you have many failures. And I just want to say, and successes. And we have even a motto in my lab that the goal is not to avoid failure, it's to fail fast and get up and sing your song and get on to the next thing. And I must say that in addition to practicing at failure, which I've done so diligently, practicing isn't enough. It's not enough to experience failure. I actually learned as much from my negative role models as I did from my positive ones. So go out there and look at all these, and it's not like you're making fun of them or you're disrespecting them or anything. They had trouble, and you're trying to learn from their trouble without having to personally experience it. But you need to go beyond that, not just learn from your negative role models, but you need to invent failures that neither you nor they have to experience. So it's like, think about machine learning. You know, this game of Go and chess. One of the big breakthroughs was big data. But then the big breakthrough after that was you run out of big data, and you have to start making up your own data. So you play yourself. You play a huge number of games against yourself. Well, you could do that too. I mean, I'm really good at inventing failures in my own mind and trying to live up to them. Okay, anyway, so I'll cut it there, and we have Q&A. Thank you very much.
That was George Church, everybody. Thank you, George. There's some pitfalls of shoes and acids and site visits and research studies. I didn't know it could be so dangerous. While we set up for the Q&A session, I have a trilogy of interview horror stories for you. First of all, I'm 1 hour late for a job interview because I'm stuck in traffic. I did get to interview, only to find out they rejected me because I was late. Went for a job interview, had baked beans for lunch. And you can see where this one's going. I'm waiting to be called in, and I'm alone in the room, so I think it's a good time. Then the boss walked in. They didn't get the job. I was interviewing for a master's. I was really worried, and at the end, I blurted out, "Okay, that's why I want to study here at the Center of Hydrogen Storage." But the name of the center was energy storage. I'm going to hand over now to John Werner, who is the curator of TEDx Beacon Street, and he's going to lead the Q&A with our speakers. John Werner, everybody.
Okay, thank you. So who's here right now? Raise your hand. Great. Hey, thanks for being here. This is like a historic event. I love the proximity to the dome. You know, that when you think of the campus of MIT, you think of the McLaren building and the dome, R2D2 sometimes created up there. And I think where we are, you know, at this great institution and talking about failure says a lot. So who watched the World Series recently? Anyone? Who knows that the Red Sox won? So I don't know much about baseball, and I know that I think if it was invented today, it wouldn't do very well in the current media market, but it was invented a long time ago. The first actual World Series happened where Northeastern is. They built Northeastern over where it was. But baseball, a lot of times the batters, you know, miss the ball more than they don't. And it's a sport about failing. And today with social media, we create these identities on Facebook that show us succeeding. And I saw on one of my feeds that I think it was National Stutter Week or Stutter Day, celebrate people who stutter. And I have a few friends that stutter, and every time they meet someone new, there's like, they're judged and they feel that they're failing, and they overcome that. And how many of us, you know, deal with that? Just something to think about. So Facebook has sort of co-opted the word friend. And I looked up the word fail, and it's been around since the 1200s. And I wonder if this little event and a movement around getting people to talk about failure could help change how we think of that word and have it kind of help make us stronger and more powerful. So who is connected with MIT and Harvard here? Just raise your hand. So we have a lot of you. How many of you know someone or yourself applied for a postdoc or a PhD program or get into a highly selective school and maybe applied a second time because you didn't make it the first time? And I said, do you know someone or are you? So if you're that person, you don't want people to know, you could raise your hand and say you know someone. How many know someone or you're that person? All right. So, you know, that means you're tenacious and you're not taking failure sitting down. I know the founders of this movement were thinking about the imposter syndrome. Has anyone heard of that? And that, you know, a lot of people, they come to a place like MIT, a mecca for talent, and wonder, hey, am I a fraud? Who's thought you may be a fraud? Yeah. So I think we're trying to get at that. And I also really appreciate what all our speakers had to say, because they took the time to reflect on these things, and they used humor. And I think a lot of people who fail, they don't reflect on it, and they don't kind of put it in humor context, because sometimes when you fail, it's not humorous. So thank you. You know, we had the gambler. He had to leave. Sandy had to leave. He's probably gambling on something. We have the teacher. You know, how many are you grad students are teaching right now? You know, so I think, you know, that was very instructive. We have the startup CEO. You know, more and more people are going into startups. I think it's interesting to hear some of the challenges of that and identify with failure. We have the journalist who's a real pathfinder, you know, taking a new route. And we have George Church, there's no other George Church. And I've talked to you about this. You know, you said dyslexia, narcoleptic, OCD. Did I mention another one? ADD. Yeah, you and I have said a word about that we're, what is it, mentally different? How do you describe all those things that you have? Neuroatypical. So I think we present ourselves all trying to be a one way, and yet there's a lot of different ways of being. And I think the founders of this were thinking about the imposter syndrome, but I also think there's mental illness out there, and there are ways that people deal with the world differently. And whether it's in your personal life or in your professional life, we fail, and thinking about that. So a bunch of people texted in some questions that I'm going to put out there. But who heard something today that was inspiring? Let me just see. So you guys did great. Thank you, speakers. So here's a question. Acceptance of failure, if it becomes more widespread, do you think that'll help our society go from very competitive to more collaborative? Do you think by promoting that failing is okay, it'll help create a more collaborative society? Anyone?
I mean, I think if we accept that failure is one of the best learning experiences we have, then we'll be more accepting of people as they experiment their way through figuring out how to be smart about things. The magazine that I was talking about that we started has an internal staff motto, which is, "It seemed like a good idea at the time." And we have fallen on our face so many times, and it has taught us so much, not only about accepting our own failures, but about looking across at least my field of science journalism and trying to get smarter about what makes it work and how to help other people succeed. And I'm going to say, listening to everyone tell these stories, you recognize that when you listen to people who have gone through, everyone does, catastrophic fails, it connects us in a way that polished professional, I'm always do everything perfectly, I've never made a bad mistake in my life kind of thing is the facade that most of us like to put out in the professional world. Failure is more connective, I think.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Does does a community that accepts failure, does it help with collaboration? What are your thoughts on that?
I think there's another very real way in which it can help people collaborate. In that, I think everybody who told their story today talked about how they learned from their own failures. But the more that we talk about failure, the more we can actually learn from each other's failure. If we're not hiding what happened, and if we're not feeling as though we can't talk about what went well for us and also what went poorly for us, that means that everybody has to make their own mistakes. And I think if we can learn from other people's mistakes, as well as learning from our own mistakes, that really helps society, I guess.
So another question that was posed, what are the social and economic effects of greater acceptance of failure? This is similar to the prior question, but quantifying it. What do you think happens in society and the economy, GDP, if we accept failure better? Instead of just having fire drills, we have failure drills. So social and economic.
I think it is very related to the previous question. I think what I would like to see is that it might encourage more honesty, in the sense that I think a lot of dissembling comes out of trying to avoid acknowledging that there was a failure. And of course, there's a huge amount of friction that comes out of people, in effect, not presenting the real facts. So it would be extremely efficient. I don't know how to quantify that, but of course it is much more efficient when people just say, this is not working, I screwed up, you just move on. I think there would be a great deal of benefit, not just morally, but also from a practical point of view.
I think I have a mic on.
Okay.
All right, so.
Or you're just really, you're the voice of God.
I think my voice is failing, by the way, so I think that when we detach ourselves from our failures, we fail even bigger. You know, in the Soviet Union and in Mao Zedong's, there was a denial of facts. They were uncomfortable facts. They were not well aligned with the ideology, and so sometimes for 30 years you could go without accepting a fact, and that really delays recovery and excellence. So you know, modern day Russia and China are amazing, partly because they've embraced failure a little bit better than they did in the past.
Interesting. Well, so it goes over generations. I mean, I think of, who's a millennial here? Anyone a millennial? Who's Gen Z or what? I don't know. You know what you're even calling them yet. But I think the generations that are coming up, I think they like experiences, and they like you know, being able to document experiences. And I think if we can make it mainstream that it's okay to document failure, and it becomes part of your identity, and it helps make you stronger, that can, you know, instead of denying over generations that things are happening. So another question is, what is the most important thing to do after you fail? So this is all relative, and you talked about first world problem failures, but what do you guys think? You know, you all worked on your remarks today. As you think about it, what advice do you have to folks here who are trying to become better at failing?
I don't know why you've probably heard the saying, if you can't be a good if you can't be a good role model, be the terrible example. Occasionally I am just the terrible example. And what I say to my own kids is the most important thing about a failure or a mistake is that you learn from it. And in fact, I think our failures make us smarter if we allow them to do so. And I also think something else, and I've thought about this as we've talked about acceptance of failure, you're actually more willing to take risks and work to exceed your reach if you're comfortable with the idea that you may fail. And I've done journalistic projects that did not live up to what I wanted them to be, right? They were beyond what I set the goal for, but they made me a smarter journalist. And I think that the more we're comfortable with that idea, right? And journalism, it's public failure, right? We make all our mistakes in public, right? Other people can try to, shelter their mistakes in some way, but if you're a journalist and you screw up, it's out there for everyone to see. So in fact, we often are the terrible example of failure. But I think that it's really important to get to a comfort level with that, because then you get to take a chance on yourself and you accept failures by other people as part of the learning process.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, one of the distressing parts about failure, it's like it's this loss of control to some extent, right? Because I feel that this was something that I should have had control over, and I lost control. I wasn't in charge the way I wanted to, or I thought I could, or I should have, for the sake of other people. And then this divide and conquer, so analyzing and saying, okay, what went wrong? What were the things I could have done something about? What were the things I could not have done something about? Make that sort of taxonomy, and then look over all the things that you could have done something about one by one. And one by one, it's just not as scary. And figure out where you went wrong, what you would have done differently. And I think the detachment that comes from that means that you're no longer looking at it, you're looking at it with a critical eye, but not critically. It's much more empowering. And it's like if you were helping a friend to do that. If your friend comes and says, this is terrible. You're like, okay, calm down. Tell me what happened. Well, you couldn't have done something about that. All right, okay, you screwed up there, but what would you do differently next time? And it's sort of almost talking to yourself as you would to a dear friend. And I think that I find that very helpful.
So I have a two-part question here. So when I work with teams, I often give an example of a failure that's out there as a way to validate that it's okay. And I often reference a TV show that many of you may not have seen, but WKRP in Cincinnati. It was a great show back in the day. And there's this guy, Herb, who is a PR guy for a radio station, and he rented a plane, and he took some turkeys up and pushed them out the window to celebrate the radio station around Thanksgiving, not knowing that turkeys don't fly, and I think it was an epic fail. So I often use it as an example to say, oh, let's not be like Herb. So I'm curious, when you're with your teams, is there an epic fail that you reference as a way to kind of validate it? So that's part one, so think about that. And then part two, as all of you were thinking about what to present here today, did you have a backup fail that you were going to talk about that might also give us more insight into your inner soul or your history at failing? So you can answer in whatever order those two questions, but is there a WKRP story you have? And then what was your backup fail? Thank you very much in advance.
I think turkeys can fly, actually.
Well, in WKRP they didn't.
Didn't fly, I see.
I don't know, this is not at all it's the wildlife idea, but, so this was not my failure, but when I was working out in California, the paper sent me up to cover a glacial expansion in Alaska. It was, this glacier was moving unusually fast, and it was walling off this tiny fishing village in the panhandle of Alaska called Yakutat. And I went there with a photographer. This place was just, we had to rent a car from Marv, who had the only rental cars in Yakutat, and we were in this car that was covered with, it was growing moss, and the doors didn't close. So I was always like trying not to fall out of the car. And my photographer wanted to get these great wildlife shots. The turkey made me think of it. And so he wanted to get a picture of a grizzly bear, and we spent every single night in the dump. Just let you know, photographers are truly crazy, and so in a kind of, take a lesson from what my mistake, don't go sit in a dump trying to attract grizzly bears in the middle of the night in Alaska. And the last night we were there, he was so desperate.
Did you smear yourself with honey?
No, but he had bought some bologna sandwiches and let them rot in the trunk during the time we were there. So we're sitting in the car trying to attract the grizzlies, and I'm going, well, I wasn't trying to attract the grizzlies. I go, what is this horrible smell in the car? And he goes, I hear the grizzlies like the smell of rotting meat. So I filled the car with rotten bologna sandwiches. And I made him throw all the sandwiches out, and he didn't speak to me for the rest of the trip. So that was an epic failure between journalist and photographer, and I advise you never to sit in a dump in Yakutat, Alaska. How's that for a learning experience with rotting bologna sandwiches?
So anyone else, is there a failure that you reference, in history, and then what was your backup failure?
I think it's quite a success to get bologna to rot. I think, it's so full of BHA.
Indestructible. It's like spam.
This can smell terrible.
It's like your diet you went on.
Yeah.
It's funny, this actually wasn't my backup fail, but that reminds me of a different, well, it could have been my backup fail. So my backup to my backup. Yeah. So everyone has a rotting sandwich story. Yeah. So the first time I ever was trusted to babysit, we had bears. The first time I ever was trusted to babysit, I was 13 and I was babysitting an 11-year-old and a 10-year-old. And we were sort of sitting around the couch, and I hear the dog come in the doggy door, and we're sitting there, and we're playing Monopoly and kind of cheating a little bit, but mostly having good, clean fun. And my friend Zoe says, "What's that smell?" And Jay says, "It kind of smells like a skunk." And the dog had actually gotten sprayed by a skunk from about 5 feet away. Absolutely, like point blank range. So she was ruined, and she by this point had gotten into the house and was delightedly rolling around on the carpet and running all of the skunk ink off onto the Zoe and Chase's parents' nice house. So I didn't know much about anything at the time because I was 13. But I did know that you were supposed to bathe a dog in tomato sauce if it got sprayed by a skunk. So I was like, tomato sauce. We have any tomato sauce? Well, we didn't. But what we did have was ketchup and cans of peeled tomatoes. So we trooped out. So luckily we were on a lake. So we took these things. We trooped out down to the lake, holding Marianne by her collar, and we dumped out the entire ketchup bottle all over her, and took her out into the lake, and each of us grabbed 2 peeled tomatoes in our 2 hands, and we rubbed her with peeled tomatoes for about an hour and a half. I didn't get to babysit again until I was 16. So that was not actually my backup. My backup was, what was my backup?
Like the story you were going to
What was my backup story? I think it was something.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, I think that one was better. If I thought of that one before, that would have been my backup.
So here are 2 questions, and take either one, you guys. So a lot of the failure talks today were about how you failed, but I think we work in teams where we'll often work with someone that it's part of their identity that they don't fail. and it's really, you know that lab partner you've had in high school who, can't handle getting anything other than an A+. I guess as leaders and people that collaborate, how do you collaborate with someone that can't handle failure? Because if we're going to be an effective society, we need to collaborate well. So that's one question. And then another question, at this time, climate change, genetics, cyber issues, there's all these big technical challenges, environmental challenges, scientific challenges, engineering challenges. Is not accepting failure holding us back from reaching our potential? That's sort of a big meta question. So working with someone who can't fail, any thoughts on that? And the second question, how do we save humanity?
You want to do that?
Well, the first one's easy. I just say, look, we're a team. I'll do all the failure, you do all the success, right? So that works out. So you can even accept the other one's failure,
Yeah. So George, is it true you walk around your office with blinders, like a horse would use when they're running a track, to show that you want people to think creatively outside the lanes? Do you do that?
I don't do that today, but I did do that as a graduate student.
Yeah,
yes,
so you encourage people to think outside the box.
I thought it was funny, yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. Anyone, other thoughts? How do you work with someone who doesn't, like Spock, doesn't like being emotional on the start? It's the fictitious show Star Trek, although I believe it's true.
Well, I mean, so one thing, it depends a lot on what kind of thing that you're working on, but one thing that's helped me a lot has basically been trying to, as much as possible, remove the personal judgment around evaluation of your contribution, right? So as much as possible, make it quantitative. As much as possible, just lay out, like, this is the stuff that we're trying to do together. And if it's something that you can be very objective about whether or not that thing has been done mysteriously, it happened to us like the weather, that this thing did get done or didn't get done, or this thing had this result or didn't have this result, that makes it much more easy to, much more easy on the sort of human psychological level to engage with, okay, well, if this didn't happen, how can we make it happen, as opposed to this thing failed to happen, we have failed as a team, and sort of this is the result of our working together. So as much as possible, if it's a really useful tool to kind of divorce the judgment and divorce the sort of personal reflection nature sort of aspect of any given project, so that you can actually engage on the merits, and so you can actually engage on what is working or what isn't working.
So one of the things I've given myself the liberty to do, now that I'm more established, feel more comfortable, is write papers called lessons learned. And I think that one of the things that happens, at least in engineering, but I think in all domains, is you usually write the paper about the thing that worked. But to get to the thing that worked, you did a whole lot of things that didn't work. Some of them, in retrospect, were stupid, but maybe they weren't stupid at the time, given what you knew and given the general understanding. So it's a bit of a turning things around, of saying, yes, I understand that you spent a year of your life doing something which didn't pan out. But try, again, go back, distill, and write a lessons learned of things not to do. And I think it's as important, not just, as you were saying, being an example of what not to be, but also what are the things that I tried that didn't work out, and why did they not work out? Because if you've done an intelligent analysis of why they have not worked out, that is in itself very useful. And so I started doing more of these, also things like myth busting, writing papers about these are commonly held assumptions, but they're wrong. And approaching it not from the point of view of they're wrong, you moron, but they're wrong, I thought they were right also, and this is why I've convinced myself that they're not right. So I think that also changing a little bit of dialogue, whether it's, again, being very non-judgmental, or simply explaining, again, in a dispassionate but empathetic way. Dispassionate that you're just stating facts, but empathetic in the sense that you're sharing the fact that you also had this misconception, or you also took that road that wasn't successful. I think that that's helpful.
Yes, I was thinking about this when you were talking about recognizing when things aren't working and responding quickly. So one of the rules we have, I have a small office of six and a half employees, and the number one rule is don't sulk. So if something is bothering you, you don't, sit and stew about it and allow resentments to build up. You come and talk about it. And then, I was reminded of this, and you reminded me of it. I went to a meeting at the National Association of Science Writers. They had several editors get together and talk about, management, which is something that we fumble our way through in journalism. People get promoted because they're good reporters, but they don't have any management training. And they had one of the people from HHMI, science editor of the Washington Post, science editor of Science News, and the editor of a magazine published by the Simons Foundation, Spectrum, which is literally about the science of people on the spectrum. And the number one thing they all agreed on, they said, that uncomfortable conversation that you've been dreading, what's the most important thing you do about that? You have it. And I went back, because I actually had one of those that I'd been avoiding, and I went right back and I had the uncomfortable conversation, and then we started fixing it. So I think all of this, in part, is being very direct and allowing people to have their say, and having a don't sulk rule. It suits no one and helps no one.
I think actually one thing that you brought up, Muriel, in the course of describing this is when you do a lessons learned, or when you do a sort of a recap, or or when you say, let me break this down into this thing didn't work, this thing didn't work. When something fails, if it was set up well in the beginning, there are actually usually things about it that succeeded, or things about it that were actually right. And I think when we're doing postmortems, or when we're doing debriefs, this is another sort of human psychological instinct, is to classify a project, an entire effort, as a success or a failure, and not recognize that you have lessons learned from the successes about what not to do that way next time, right? And also lessons learned from the failures that actually went really well, even though the overall effort didn't turn out the way that you wanted to.
Sorry, if I may add to that, it may also be that you actually thought it was a failure and it was not a complete failure. I think that's the other thing to think about. I'll go back to the example of my class, which had subterranean reviews. But some of them were very funny, I have to say, rude, but very funny. But one of the things I was struck by, so I mentioned that the class was one of the classes that was required, in effect, for students in a certain area for qualifying for their doctorate, so they wouldn't get kicked out and have to frame the pictures. And every single student who took the class that year with me, because some of them were taking, you had taken the class the year before, you had 2 years in effect in which to take your exam, got the highest grade. And the following year, where, at this point, it was a year old, the following year, they still all got the highest grade. Now, how they learned the material that well with my teaching it is beyond me. I mean, they must have gone and read the book. But it had succeeded on that point of view, from the point of view of actually measuring it in terms of an exam administered not by me, but by the department. It had succeeded. So to some extent, I remember looking back at that and saying, well, it actually wasn't as bad as I thought. And so that's the other thing that happens, is you look in toto and clearly it was a failure, and yet there was a success in there once you broke it down.
I suddenly remembered that we were also going to try to save the world, and so I know, me too. That's the problem. We all failed to save the world. And I wanted to mention something that's considered a classic failure in that regard in science journalism, which is that if you look at the early coverage of an issue like climate change, journalism followed the very political model of there's always two sides to this issue. And when you look at the early coverage of climate change, particularly in the 80s and 90s, you will see an equally weighted discussion. There will be scientists who are often paid by the oil and gas industry to discredit climate change, were given equal weight with the people who were studying this and actually and even were in the consensus about what was happening. We look at this as an epic fail in science journalism. The failure to adapt, to figure out where the weight of the evidence was, and report from that. And we've asked ourselves, and this comes up in many science journalism meetings, did we contribute to climate denialism by the way we told that story? So now, speaking of learning from failure, because we actually do want to save the world, we don't report in the same way. And you will see a lot of accusations against journalists because we'll report climate change as a reality. Because our decision is that accuracy involves not two equally weighted sides necessarily, but figuring out where the weight of the evidence is and reporting from that. And so we're starting to shift that, and you'll see in the way we tell stories of other issues, genetics, vaccines, right? How do we tell the story of vaccines? There are not two equal sides, right? So as you look across the landscape of science journalism in that, can we make this better? Can we change the world? That is a fail, and that is a fail that we are learning from and trying to correct.
Great. So you guys, in closing, I'd like you each to give one closing advice. Kurt Vonnegut once said, "Oh, wear sunscreen." What's your one advice to this audience? Before you do, I want to do two thank yous. One is Richard, are you here? And Francesco, and all the organizers. I think it was the graduate students at MIT that came together, a lot of international graduate students said, hey, let's celebrate this idea of fail to help make it mainstream and help us be a more productive community and society. So if you're part of the team that organizes, please just stand up. Let's recognize you guys and thank you. Francesco, stand up. Yeah. So, what's interesting here is these grad students may stay at MIT in perpetuity and never leave, but some of them may go back to other institutions or may go into the real world, kind of like Mira's running businesses. I think you run businesses too, and they could spread this idea. Another group I want to thank is these speakers, kind of like the milk advertisements. I got milk, I drink milk. They're poster children for failure. And these are highly successful people, highly competent people, people I'd have over for dinner, people I'd want to work with, but they're putting themselves out there. And I think this is an idea, and the talent in this room is extraordinary. I mean, the next Google could be two people that meet here, and Google could be, not even remembered 100 years from now because of someone putting it out of business. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but there's talent here. And climate change, some profound stuff could happen, and by accepting failure, maybe we can address some of these challenges. I was with an AI expert who said, oh, we're cooked in 100 years as a species. We can't deal with climate change, but it's going to be people in this room that are going to be able to be innovative and collaborative, that are going to be able to make sure, we reach our potential. So what's your wear sunscreen advice in closing?
I think that part also of feeling in control is realizing if this one thing fails, you can do other things. That's another backup, I mean, it can't be that everything rides on this one project, this one job, this one gig that you got yourself into. And again, I think that helps in terms of getting yourself out of the situation and having some perspective. So you have backups. You have lots and lots of backups. As you were saying, these are first world problems. So you can go on to do other things.
Laugh at yourself. We're all going to, make mistakes, and they're often really funny. Allow yourself to see the humor in it.
Yes, I would say fail fast, fail a lot, but succeed while you're at it. But back to global catastrophe, I think we're setting ourselves up for failure in a classic way. I don't like gambling, in contrast to Sandy. It's unavoidable to some extent, but I think we are currently setting up the classic. It's not even a gamble, it's almost for sure. We have all our eggs in one basket. We have a kind of a global village. It used to be we had a lot of independent experiments that were doing different things. Occasionally they would find each other and one would win. But anyway, we're sitting ducks for an asteroid or for some kind of global pandemic, something like that. We need to have colonies. I think the lesson learned is diversity, is spreading out your bets on a lot of things. And we're not exactly doing that. We're aiming towards a monoculture. all in one place.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I think the one thing that I would say is, regardless of what your field is get your hands dirty. Just get in there. If you're thinking about working on something, or if you're thinking about going after a project, if you're thinking about starting a company, if you're thinking about starting a family, I would say just not doing something is just as much a decision as doing something, and you should just really get in there and be an actor, change history.
So last thing, and I'm adding this, and then there's a reception downstairs, a lot of food, and I think she brought the bologna. I don't think she brought the bologna, or you brought the bologna. What's one thing this audience could help you with? Is, you've put yourselves out there about how you're a failure. Ask for help, or is there something you're looking for what you're doing?
You were asking about generations, and
No, this is for you, like
for me.
your company, for your class. What
Yeah, I would like to hear.
more genetic material?
I would actually like to hear, but probably later in the reception, from people in the generation how they view themselves. If they feel that they're allowed to fail. I think that would be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I worry too much. I worry that people who are telling the stories of science are a bottleneck of professionals like me. I would ask everyone here who's a scientist or an engineer to share, right? Tell people what you do. Don't consider it in the bubble property until we can comfortably do that. We're not going to be moving toward one of my other goals, which is a truly science-literate society.
So citizen journalism.
Yes.
Yeah. By
and
scientists.
Scientists as citizens, I think.
Put it out there, yeah.
Yeah, I'd have to second that motion. Sharing, transparency, whatever you feel comfortable with. I'm guinea pig number one in the Personal Genome Project, so all my medical records and my genome are publicly available. You don't need to go that far, but whatever you can do to help everybody destigmatize failure, destigmatize human variation, cultural differences, do your part by letting your freak flag fly.
Mira, I know you're starting like 30 companies,
Yeah, I was
and you
about
have
to
6
say,
petabytes of data. You need
Very
coders.
selfishly, we're hiring aggressively. So if anyone's looking for some interesting, very data wrangling heavy work, please talk to me or talk to John after. But other than that, I mean, I think there is a lot of value in talking about, and just basically talking about what works for you and doesn't work for you. Because as I said, I think one thing very tactically that helps the companies that I work with succeed is actually watching other companies stumble and fall and try things that work and don't work, and learning from their successes and their failures. And I think what works for companies can work for people too. If you're an observer and if you're a sharer, then you can really learn a lot from each other.
Great. If you like something tonight, let's give them a standing ovation. If you don't, just stay seated. So stand up if you like something. Woo! And free food downstairs and no baloney. Thank you very much. Thank you to our amazing host.